Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button below. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au. Welcome to this 77th Australian Water School webinar brought to you by iSwarm. It's a pleasure and we're so glad you could join us today to discuss this critical issue of responding to climate change in Papua New Guinea, presented by Dr. Kylie McKenna, University of Technology, Sydney, and Divine Word, University, PNG. My name's Trevor Pillar. I'm the National Partnerships Manager here at iSwarm and the webinar chair. Yes, it's really good to have you all here. Look at that, spread across the globe, quite a lot from Australia, New Zealand, but a really lovely spread throughout the world. Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear us clearly. Use the chat line if you have any trouble or want to introduce to each other. That'd be great. There's a lot of webinars, online courses, face-to-face courses coming up in the next 6 months. Here's just a month's worth here, but you can see it covers a vast range of water management issues. I won't go into each one, but by all means, go to our website, follow our Twitter feed, and you'll get all the details about those webinars. I've done all that, and now we're going to get right into the middle of this now. Kylie, do come join us on screen. Dr. Kylie McKenna is from the University, Technology and Divine Word, University, PNG. Thanks for joining us, Kylie. Your microphone's still coming to life. That's it, yep. Kylie's Director of the Centre for Social Research, Divine Word University, Papua New Guinea, and Research Principal at the University of Technology, Sydney, Institute for Sustainable Futures. Kylie, you've done a lot of things. Worked as a sociologist in Papua New Guinea for the past 10 years, and has included much work in community engagement on development impacts, hence the title of this webinar, How Development. Wait a minute, where are you today? You're in New Guinea, no doubt.
I am. I'm joining you from Papua New Guinea, so thank you so much, Trevor, for your very kind introduction. It's great to be joining you.
Right, and you're in what part of New Guinea?
I'm in a place called Madang, which is on the north coast of the mainland.
That's a long way from here and a long way from anywhere, I'd say. When I say here, I mean I'm in the southern part of Australia, in Adelaide, and a warm and paradise.
Very, very hot day here.
Very hot day, right?
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, my air conditioner is broken down at the moment, so you might see me glowing.
No, you're looking well. A picture of health. What's like Madang? Like we're talking a metre of rain a year or more. We're talking high rainfall area there.
We do have heavy rainfall. There is a rainy season which we're not in at the moment.
Not in, right?
Yeah. So it's quite dry. Often it will. Actually, the last few weeks it hasn't rained too much at all, but we do get the big tropical downpours, which is quite nice.
But it's early days for you there. You're normally a Sydney girl.
That's right. So I'm usually based at the University of Technology, Sydney, at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. And I've just taken leave without pay from ISF for a year to come over and help some colleagues of mine here at Divine Word University.
That's the thing that was on my mind to ask. Why would anybody leave beautiful Sydney to go into beautiful Madang? Well, let's be careful about what we say here, and especially when you're doing it fairly much, completely because you believe in what you're doing. That's what I love about these webinars, having people like yourself who are there because they totally believe in it. What's your motivation and driver for the work that you do?
My motivation is I've been working in Papua New Guinea for a long time now. I did my PhD here on Bougainville and also on the other side of the border in West Papua. And I'm really committed to, especially to Papua New Guinea. West Papua is a little bit more tricky for researchers to access. But in Papua New Guinea, I've been coming and going for a long time now, but never have been embedded here. Yep. And I would really like to have that longer term engagement with Papua New Guinea so it gets away from the more kind of contractual relationship with this country and to have this long term embedded engagement.
Nothing like a scientist who's in the field and loves getting hands dirty, get in there doing it with everybody else. That's fantastic. You get the data you need. Yeah, that's right. Very blessed. Yeah, that's right. I'm going to leave it right there and hand right over to you. I can see Anthony's already put up a question or comment. Well, post a reference to your PhD. I'm interested in learning more about Bougainville. That's Anthony Ladson. Thanks very much, Anthony. We'll do that for sure. Appreciate your comment there on the Q&A. People, if you'd like to click your Q&A icon, you'll see these questions yourself. But we'll do that as time goes by through this webinar. All right then, it's completely over to you. Handing this into your hands, and as we get questions, I might interrupt at the right.
Okay, yeah, feel free.
All right.
And any questions, I'm very happy to take those. And if we don't get around to them today, I will also pass on my email address to Trevor, and it's on the front page of this presentation. So,
fantastic.
Yeah, feel very welcome to contact me. I'm happy to be in contact. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen now.
Wonderful. Over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you again for the very kind introduction and welcome. So my name's Kylie McKenna, as we just mentioned. I'm representing a group, a project team today. So it's not just me involved in this research. We have a number of colleagues at the Institute for Sustainable Futures in Sydney, my colleagues Brent Jacobs and Louise Borignac. And also I have some colleagues here in Papua New Guinea who are also based in Madang at a place called the New Guinea Binatang Research Centre, which is an environmental NGO based in Papua New Guinea. So they've been our project partners. There's been this partnership between UTS ISF and Binatang Research Centre. And what I'm going to be doing today is discussing a project that we've been engaged in for about the last 3 years. So I'll start off by just introducing you to some of the key aspects of the project that we've been involved in. I will talk a little bit about climate change in Papua New Guinea and provide some of the climate change projections for this country. And a lot of my talk today will focus on the workshop processes we used and the very participatory research methods we engaged our communities in. So I'm hoping that those workshop processes might be helpful for you in terms of your own work, but it's also a good way to illustrate the key climate change concerns or biodiversity concerns that communities are having here in Papua New Guinea. And yeah, it did give us a very hands-on taste for some of the concerns that people do attribute to a changing climate. And even though those concerns vary considerably across the country, it did give us a sense of what those main issues are. So just to recap, this is the name of the project, Engaging Communities and Government in Biodiversity Conservation and Climate Change Adaptation Project. It was funded by USAID. We had over 190 people participate in the project, both community members and also government representatives. So in Papua New Guinea, we have a provincial government system, and we had 2 provincial governments involved in our project. The first is Madang Provincial Administration and the Eastern Highlands Provincial Administration. And so in addition to those 2 governments, we worked with 4 communities, 3 in Madang province, which is where I now live, and then 1 in Eastern Highlands province. For those of you who aren't familiar with Papua New Guinea, but have probably heard of it, the most well-known town in Eastern Highlands province is Goroka, and our community was not all that far away from Goroka. So those communities are Riwo, Ohu, Bundi and Hogave, and Riwo is very close to my university here. The reason we chose these communities is that they effectively formed a transect from the coast. So Riwo is right on the edge of the water. You couldn't get any closer. The hinterland in Ohu, up to the Highlands. So Bundi, it would be classed as a Highlands area of Madang. So even though Madang is a provincial, a coastal province, we still have very high areas and people living very high up in the mountains. It's quite an amazing part of the world. And these places also illustrate a very broad range of climate and development issues faced by these communities and communities throughout PNG more broadly. And we'll discuss some of those a bit later on. Just by way of an introduction, I wanted to talk about PNG's contributions to greenhouse gas emissions because it does pick up on some interesting things about the PNG economy. So PNG has very low levels of greenhouse gas emissions, so less than 0.1% of global emissions. But this is very high relative to PNG's level of development. And you probably will be aware of many of the human development challenges we experience in Papua New Guinea. 40% of the PNG population are living on less than US $1.25 per day. There's also incredible challenges in terms of healthcare provision, access to education, and delivery of basic services. So the emissions in Papua New Guinea are primarily coming from land use change and forestry. So most of the Papua New Guinea population live in rural areas and they're dependent on subsistence agriculture. But the economy is also very dominated by two sectors in particular that are very dependent on the environment. So they are the agriculture, forestry and fisheries, and also the oil, mineral and energy sectors. And you probably, well, you may have heard of a number of high-profile cases involving multinational corporations here in Papua New Guinea. Potentially one of the most famous examples is the Bougainville copper mine, which became entangled in a decade-long civil conflict. But there's also been Octedi, which has had a history of quite severe environmental impacts, and we continue to have instances of negative impacts associated with the extractive companies here. In terms of key changes noted in PNG's climate, maximum annual temperatures have increased by 0.13 degrees per decade, and minimum annual temperatures have increased by 0.3 degrees per decade. There's been a substantial variation in rainfall, but little change in extreme daily rainfall since 1945. The sea level has risen near Papua New Guinea by about 7 millimetres per year, and this is obviously a big concern for coastal areas and for PNG's islands provinces. And ocean acidification has been increasing with impacts on the growth of corals and organisms that construct their skeletons from carbonate minerals. But of these, probably it's sea level rise which has received the most international attention. And you may have heard of the migration of, or attempts to migrate from the Carteret Islands over to Bougainville. And it's been raising all sorts of issues associated with customary land rights and how people can relocate to different areas when they don't have those customary ties to land. In terms of the climate projections, the annual mean temperatures and extremely high daily temperatures are expected to rise. Average rainfall is projected to increase in most areas, along with more extreme rain events. Droughts are projected to decline in frequency by the end of the century. And this is important because in Papua New Guinea, there's been a lot of impacts associated with El Nino droughts, particularly in the Highlands. So there's been periods of drought followed by repeated frosts, and that's had quite big impacts on staple food crops, especially on sweet potato. And some parts of Papua New Guinea have experienced famine as a result of those droughts. Sea level is expected to continue to rise. Ocean acidification is expected to continue. The risk of coral bleaching is expected to increase, and tropical cyclones, again affecting coastal and islands provinces, are projected to be less frequent but much more intense. Some of the hazards that the Papua New Guinea government have attributed to a changing climate that they've raised as key issues they're concerned about: coastal flooding, the effects and spread of malaria. So the spread of malaria into Highlands regions where they previously didn't have incidents of malaria. Destruction of coral reefs for the tourist industry here. Landslides. This is a massive issue in Papua New Guinea because roads in rural areas are incredibly dangerous. Yeah, when you have higher and more heavy rainfall on already existing and damaging roads, it's a big concern for people. And also variability in agricultural yields, which affect many agricultural regions. And as I was saying, the majority of the PNG population live in rural areas, and it's still a very much subsistence-based lifestyle. So despite some of these notable environmental impacts, much of the literature on Papua New Guinea and environmental change tends to focus on the large multinational corporations. I think that is one side effect of these high-profile cases, and I myself have been one of those people who have wanted to focus on the multinational aspect. And there's been a lot of attempts in recent years to develop more participatory processes for landowners to be a part of negotiations to establish large extractive projects. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that communities themselves undertake activities that also impact on ecosystem services. So while these are much smaller scale projects, they do also have an impact on the environment. And I think it was important in this project to see that the communities themselves are constantly also engaging in their own cost-benefit analysis of whether to develop these projects and thinking through some of the consequences of that. So that includes, for example, the extension of roads to, very importantly, be able to access the town to sell produce at the local markets, to establish new buildings such as a healthcare centre or an aid post, undertaking selective logging, or on the other hand, to try to establish community conservation reserves or natural resource-based businesses. So here I just wanted to pose the question, and Trevor, you might be able to jump in here as to whether we can ask participants to answer the question.
Yep, let's do that. Here we go. Thanks, Joel. That's great. What climate change variable are you most concerned about? Why don't we do that right now? Shoot your answers in, everybody, and we'll do an on-the-fly poll. That'll be fantastic. See a lot of you on board right now. That's great. It's good. How's that looking, Joel?
Yeah, we've got
a few responses.
40% of people replied. Coming in a bit further now. I'll just unmute myself and wave as well.
Hey, well done. Well done.
Yeah, give it a few more seconds. Yep. 60%. Thank you. 10 more seconds maybe, and then we'll cut it off there.
Right.
Yep. All right, we'll finish up there.
Let's see what this says. This will be good, everyone. Thank you for taking the time on this. All right. What's your thoughts, Kylie? Let's hear this.
Well, I am also very concerned about changes in rainfall, particularly because of my experience here traveling in PNG on very dangerous roads. I have been involved in an accident in the past, so I agree. But I wanted to ask this question just to get feedback, and I was also wondering whether people are answering this question based on their own personal locations, so whether you're in Australia or Indonesia, right. And how that might differ for communities in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
That was my curiosity. And as I'm about to discuss, this was a question that we asked our communities as well. So I'll keep going through some of the processes. So this is to commence the part of the talk where I'd like to discuss the workshop processes we used with our 4 participating communities. And the workshop started by, we invited representatives of the communities to discuss changes that they themselves noted in their environments. So we did this by either asking a teacher, a priest, somebody respected in their community to talk about changes they've noted in the environment. Some of the changes related to population increases, changes in the natural resources available, such as, or not just the extinction or the depletion of natural resources, such as plants and animals, but also seeing new species in areas that previously weren't. So new fruits and vegetables that previously didn't grow in colder climates, for example. Other things that people mentioned were the proximity of roads to the sea, particularly in Madang province, associated with rising sea levels. And as I'll introduce you to in a moment, also the impacts on community health and well-being. So there's some quite serious, very serious issues that Papua New Guinean communities are dealing with. One of the activities we engaged our communities in was identifying local ecosystem services in their area. So you can see on this image, I hope, I know it's a bit blurry, but it's a large Google Earth image of one of our communities. This would be Hogave up in the Highlands. And we asked people to place little icons, which we use the Apple iPhone emoticons. Generally, we had to add a few PNG specific ones, such as betel nut and lime powder. But we asked people to identify the parts of their community that they source important goods. So whether they be sources of food, places of cultural significance, places where people might be getting feathers, for example, for their cultural shows or their sing-sings, and to be able to map out their community in terms of identifying key areas where these ecosystem services are found. We then discussed the climate impacts for the region. So in a very similar way that I just did with you. Originally, we didn't intend to discuss so much of the climate science, but we received so many requests for more information about climate change that we did include more information about the causes of climate change and the climate change science. So we also shared that information. And this picture is of a colleague of mine called Mavis. She's from Binatang Research Centre, and she's discussing this climate change projections in Tokpisin. So it was great that we could also share this information in Tokpisin and increase the awareness of climate change. And we also asked our communities the same question that I just polled you on as well. And I'll give you their results in a moment. The next activity we did was to identify ecosystem services that the communities valued, that they believed were at risk from climate change. And you can see on this map, this is called an impact map. And basically each group in the community chose a climate variable that they were most concerned about. And they then traced the impacts of that. So this is the example of hot days. It's quite challenging to do this with communities. It's hard to stop them from going straight to death. If you ask people what's the impact of this on health, it will go straight to death. But we had to really slow down with people and say, so what's the first thing you notice when there's an increase in hot days? And so, for example, here, as the soil gets hot, what happens if the soil gets hot? It destroys the garden. If the garden's destroyed, what happens? Humans feel sick. And what was interesting about that is also you can see up here, there's reconciliation, money, compensation issues. So this activity was really helpful in the sense of bringing out the interdependence, I guess, between the social and environmental impacts of climate change or of economic development. So that was a really interesting and helpful strategy, I think, the workshops used. We did the same for the impacts of development on ecosystem services. And we did this by developing development scenarios based on government interviews that I conducted with another colleague from Madang Research Centre. And we asked the provincial government administration what development projects are currently operating or are planned in future. So in Madang province, we have a very large tuna cannery. Sorry, are you still there, Trevor?
Yep, all good. We've just taken the video off in case there's there's a little bit of dropout every now and again, but it's like going fine. It's going well, but we just took the video, your camera video off just to see if we can improve the sound coming across. It's pretty good, still pretty good.
Okay, no worries.
All good.
So yeah, I was just explaining that we conducted interviews with our participating provincial administration representatives about development projects that were either currently underway or were planned in future. And the one that we have here in Madang is a big tuna cannery, which is having quite big impacts in terms of environmental pollution and also the smell that's coming from the cannery. And it brought up, what we tried to do was we tried to encompass and encourage our communities to think about both the positives and the negatives of large economic development projects. So the feedback we received was that that was quite helpful in terms of illustrating and being able to tease out these trades in terms of the positives and the negatives. We then encouraged our communities to develop their own local action projects to try to address some of these impacts. So these were very, very small scale projects and it was hard. It was a hard activity for our communities to engage with. It requires a lot of thinking and also creativity. I also did this activity with some Masters of Public Health students just last week, and they also found it hard to develop, very specific projects that communities can undertake themselves to address these impacts. Another thing we noted was that the communities often went straight to the need for money in order to undertake their project plans. But when we dug deeper on that, many of the resources they needed to implement their projects were actually already available to them. So there were things like tools, for example. So that was quite a helpful task. Another insight was that the communities felt as though they were keen to initiate projects and had done so in the past, but weren't necessarily able to keep up the momentum to see those projects fully orchestrated and implemented. So the results, I'm aware that time is running out, so I'm just going to speed through some of these results. So climate change is already having significant effects on communities. Those effects are experienced differently across the nation. Changes in rainfall, as your poll also suggested, was the biggest concern, but also rising temperatures and an increase in the number of hot days. As I mentioned, heavy rain is damaging already dangerous roads, which are crucial to access basic health, education services and access to the local market to sell produce. In Hogave, they have a conservation area. They're concerned about wildfires spreading through the area. And also I think what the workshop processes uncovered was the way these effects from climate change or environmental change have flow-on effects to food security, human health, and the well-being of communities. I'm just going to skip through this one, but I will share my slides with anyone who is interested in looking at it in more detail. These are just some of the concerns of our communities relating to increasing temperature. And this is in Ohu and Riwo. So I'm just going to skip through this one. This is an example of the positive and negative impacts of mining and how that impacted on our community in Bundi. This will be really hard for you to see on your screens, but what is important to emphasize here is both sides of the spectrum are incredibly complicated, and it's quite an intricate web of positive and negative impacts. The project plans they developed, I'll just provide a few examples. So this is Riwo in Madang province, very nearby to where I live. They wanted to focus on community education on sea level rise, developing a seawall made of sandbags, maintaining the environment through local resource mapping, bush restoration and connection, but also, as you see here, family planning. So they have a big problem with overpopulation. And there's also increasing migration into Madang province from other areas of Papua New Guinea, which has quite a lot of impacts socially. In the Highlands, yeah, this one's interesting. Protecting against malaria, as I mentioned earlier, some parts of the Highlands are now experiencing malaria, which they haven't experienced before. Again, an emphasis on health, human health, and reforestation, so protection from landslides and soil erosion. So some of further observations is that our participants were very aware of climate change and the impacts that they attribute to climate change, but their literacy about climate science was understandably very poor. And that's associated with low access to technology, lack of access to education. So that's not surprising. Communities clearly understood the immediate effects, both positive and negative, of development. There's a desire for economic development from large-scale natural resource projects, and this appears to mainly outweigh the negative consequences. So there's still a very, very keen interest in exploring extractive projects because of that desperate urge for economic gain. But there's also frustration about the lack of alternatives to natural resource development and to environmentally destructive industries such as logging. So there is that frustration as well. There were particular impacts on women and children. We were told about the impacts on women in particular in Eastern Highlands province, and the provincial government there are concerned that women are working much harder in their gardens in increasing temperatures while they're pregnant. And the sizes of their sweet potato produce are also decreasing in size. So they're working harder in their gardens for less produce whilst pregnant. And so this is creating concerns about the impact on maternal and childhood health. Often our women participants in the workshops were also very vocal, and that was great to see. They were very vocal about other vulnerabilities associated with population growth and social issues such as alcohol and substance abuse, and also a very big concern here is on domestic violence. So the women in particular were very strong on how climate change can amplify these existing vulnerabilities in Papua New Guinea society. There was enthusiasm among our participants to promote collective action and to implement these project plans that they developed. But they felt that without funding, they wouldn't be able to achieve those projects. So that was a big obstacle. We finished off our project by having a workshop with the provincial governments in the provinces where we undertook our project. And they were also concerned about issues of governance, such as funding delays from the national government, also leadership and administrative instability, communication weaknesses. We did some social network analysis to understand the existing relationships within the government, given that climate change and biodiversity conservation are cross-cutting policy issues. And they experienced that as quite a big eye-opener in the sense of the lack of collaboration across departments. But they also noted the absence of a functioning provincial Office of Climate Change. So that has been established in Madang, but it's not currently funded and not supported by all government agencies. As I mentioned before, there's also a very strong desire for more information on climate change and ways to maintain the health of their land. So I think it's also important here to say that, you know, Indigenous peoples have always responded to environmental change. At the same time, there does seem to be this interest and eagerness to gather more information from climate science. And so that was definitely expressed to us during our workshops. And we found our workshop process is a way to gather information to assess community exposure and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. And hopefully I've been able to share some of those with you today. So thank you very much for your time.
It's been fantastic to go through all these issues that you've been, maybe we could come on screen again. Yeah, that's been absolutely great to go through those issues, you know, carefully from someone who's lived there and done the science. Questions are coming through, so why don't we get stuck into those right now? Yeah. Emma is in Western Australia. Yeah, CRC for water sensitive cities. I was once part of a workshop attended by women from PNG, says Emma, reported that climate change was increasing the areas for coffee production, ironically creating more conflict in the community as men were seen as taking these gains and spending on things that didn't support the family. You just mentioned that women were becoming more vulnerable, but how do you address this vulnerability for women? Good one. Thanks, Emma. Good question.
It's an important question, and I sadly don't know how to answer it. It's a problem in many parts of Papua New Guinea and relates to so many different industries. There's coffee production, there's also the impacts of mineral, gas, oil projects, and even gender-based violence where I live. It's a very tricky, sensitive issue. And yeah, I don't have a quick answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Great issue to raise, Emma, and probably a bit longer answer than what a webinar can do. But once again, out of session, that might be able to be handled. But such a crucial issue to raise. Thank you, Emma. That's fantastic. Sanjay is from where is Sanjay from? Have a look here. Oh yeah, New South Wales in Australia. Is the SDG goal number 6, water and sanitation services, available for the communities that the researchers worked with in PNG?
No, we didn't directly focus on the SDGs. One of the reasons for that, it was very much a bottom-up process. So rather than use international frameworks, the concerns that were raised in the workshops came from them. So when I showed you the images before in terms of mapping out the ecosystem services, the issues, we didn't, you know, give them the issues that we were most concerned about, and we only put the climate science in there because of subsequent requests. So we didn't apply a specific international framework. I think maybe a gap in the project is that we could have focused more on those international aspects in the government workshops towards the end, where we did try to match the government initiatives with the project plans of our communities. So I think, yeah, that's a great suggestion in terms of.
I think part of the question also is focused on whether the services were actually available in those communities, whether water and sanitation was actually
with water and sanitation. Water and sanitation is it's another big issue here in many communities. So some no. Many communities wouldn't have access to clean water and sanitation.
No, that's right. Anthony Ladson's a hydrologist in Australia. I'm concerned about the increasing rainfall because of the threat to tailings and rock storage at mines. Difficult to contain waste in high rainfall, seismically active areas.
Yeah, and I don't know, I think this has made the Australian media. I know I did see an article in the New York Times on the weekend where we have a mine operated by a Chinese company in Madang, and there has just been a massive spill in the ocean. So if you're interested in looking at that, it's called Ramu Nickel.
Right, Ramu Nickel, yep.
Yeah, this is receiving a lot of attention at the moment.
No, thanks.
You'll see the images of the spill.
Yeah.
All the water is red. And so there's a lot of discussions now regarding what the future of that mine is going to be and what kinds of compensation or apology even might unfold from the Chinese company.
Another comment from Anthony. Thanks a lot, Anthony. More comment, although there is a question here. It's just been uploaded. I saw in some UN statistics that there are no women in the PNG Parliament. Can this be changed? I don't know whether that's a fact or not, but thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, it is. Actually have a master's student I'm supervising at the moment who's doing her master's thesis on gender quotas to try and encourage more women's participation in the National Parliament. So you're right, there is very much a lack of representation of women in the PNG Parliament. And there's quite a strong women's movement in Papua New Guinea, and some very, very strong women, including some mentors that I'm lucky to have in my life. So yeah, there are a lot of efforts to try to change that, but it's a long process. And we know that also in Australia. We also have the same problems in Australia in terms of women's representation. So yeah, absolutely.
Adnan's in Newcastle. Can you tell us what is the indicators of climate change impacting this area?
The indicators? I think can I go back to my slide or
just hit that share button.
Hit the share button.
Yep.
I just want
that's
to
good.
Back to the list that the PNG Climate Change Authority have outlined. So these are the hazards that the PNG Climate Change Authority is most concerned about. So flooding, malaria, destruction of coral reefs, landslides, damaged infrastructure, and impact on agricultural yields. But in terms of the indicators, it's very much reliant on the Western science and climate change modelling. So this is a great resource if anyone's interested in looking at Pacific countries. It's the Pacific Australia Climate Change Science and Adaptation Planning Program. So that's where there's a whole report on Papua New Guinea, and if you are interested in the Pacific region, I definitely recommend that. It's a great resource.
There's another question here from Sanjay. How to best solve the SDG 6 water and sanitation? Is this best done directly with the provincial government?
I think in Papua New Guinea, anything related to policy making needs to have an integrated approach that encompasses collaboration across the different layers of governance. I think if it's just at the national level, it's going to have problems filtering down to the local level. So we have the national government, and then we have provincial governments, and then we have district and ward levels. So it's quite a layered governance structure. And yeah, it's just a personal view is that the greater the collaboration at each of those layers is going to make it more effective. But each of those governance layers has tremendous limitations in terms of capacity, resourcing. Obviously, there's the big concerns. So that's my hunch. That people would have a different view.
Yep, so they can refer to that Pacific Australia Climate Change Science Planning Program down there. Look, we're getting to the 50-minute mark here. So we'll take this last question, I reckon. It's from Rizwan in Islamabad, and he's said he's a hydrologist in Pakistan. What will be the effect of change in rainfall patterns on water availability in Papua New Guinea?
Oh, I don't know. I can't answer.
Big one, though.
Yeah. Water isn't actually my area of expertise.
Right.
I've mainly focused on the social impacts of economic development, particularly on peace building and conflict in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, because the feasibility of that, the likelihood of that pattern, hard to predict patterns. In a place like New Guinea,
Yeah, I wish some of my colleagues here, because I worked, as I mentioned, in a team project. So they have more of that scientific expertise. So I wish they were here to answer that question, because I think it's a fantastic one.
Well, I think we'll leave it right there. It's been really good, nearly an hour, and your experience has been absolutely fantastic to be hearing the work you've been doing. So we really appreciate your time, Kylie, and I just wondered whether you had any last particular strong, this is what we must think about as we head forward in this webinar of responding to climate change in Papua New Guinea.
I wasn't expecting that.
any one sentence wrap up,
I would just encourage you to engage with Papua New Guinea. I think it's a country that often gets left out of international dialogue, and even among Australians, so few people know about what's going on in Papua New Guinea. So try and engage with your neighbours and what's happening very close to home. Because international dialogue often tends to focus much further afield, and we need to engage with our neighbours.
Yep, no, it's fantastic. That's a great closing comment. Well, we're going to leave it there, and I do encourage you to look on our website and our Twitter feed, and look at the upcoming webinars that we've got happening there. And there's a few courses coming as well. I think there was a slide that we might be able to have a look at again near the. You might have it still there, Joel. No, don't have it. Okay, well, there are courses and webinars. Next week's webinar is going to be a beauty. We're going to be talking about the Hindu Kush Himalaya climate change effects, which are similar to the one we've done today. Well, we're going to leave it right there, everybody. It's been fantastic time, and we've appreciated you speaking to us, Kylie from New Guinea, and we wish you huge success in your work there. Love to hear more about it as we go through this year into next year. Thanks again very much. Thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us. It's been a terrific discussion. See you again next time. Bye. Subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the subscription button. For future webinars and online short courses, please visit our website at australianwaterschool.com.au.